Welcome to Bridging the Gap, Law, Therapy, and Justice.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to an all new episode of Bridging the Gap, Law, Therapy, and Justice with attorney and licensed marriage and family therapist Caitlin Burgess. I am your host, Mike Leon. You know, Caitlin's practice spans law, psychology, and forensic work, giving her a unique lens on how families can find stability during and after litigation. And in today's episode, we're going to be exploring two services that are often confused with each other, but they serve very different purposes, and that's parent coordination and co parenting counseling. Kaylin, it's good to see you. I can't wait for you to explain this to us. So let's start there. How do you differentiate parenting coordinating from co parenting counseling in the simplest terms for folks?
Yeah, I will make it as simple as possible, Mike. There's so many different neutral professionals involved in the family court. And so a parenting coordinator is a neutral and a co-parenting counselor is a neutral. That is one way in which those roles are similar, but they are different. And those differences are significant and impactful. So co-parenting counseling is a therapeutic process. You need to be typically a licensed professional, a licensed psychologist, licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed social worker. Although, of course, professionals that are acquiring their hours towards licensure, if they're appropriately supervised, can take on those roles. But it's a therapeutic process. It's typically confidential. It is basically working with separated or divorced parents, trying to reach agreements in a confidential therapeutic setting to reduce the conflict and to promote healing in the relationship, rebuilding trust. And a court can order that. Parenting coordinator is different. Parenting coordination is different, and also there are some similarities. Parenting coordinators tend to become involved when the conflict is protracted and where like co-parenting counseling isn't working. I mean, there are cases where even if you have a very effective co-parenting counselor, the parties are so entrenched in their conflict that decisions aren't able to be reached. So a parenting coordinator can actually make decisions. So they have to be appointed by mutual consent of the parties. They cannot be appointed, by the court. They have to actually, the parties have to say, hey, I'm willing to agree to this individual. They can be an attorney. As well as a mental health professional. There are many parenting coordinators I have worked with in California cases that are lawyers. So, and it's directive. They can, like I said, make decisions. They are appointed by a stipulation, and the scope of their role has to be clearly outlined in that stipulation. They cannot go beyond the scope of their role. And as I believe I've mentioned, although if I haven't, I'm going to mention it now. If a parenting coordinator makes a decision and a party doesn't agree with it, they can object and get a court hearing on that particular decision.
So let's stay with one side first for a second on the co parenting counseling. Like in your experiences, right? What specific concerns, patterns tend to point towards going with co parenting counseling as the better fit?
Yeah, well, a lot of times people don't want parenting coordination because they feel like they're giving up their rights. The parent coordinator is sort of an arm of the judge. They have quasi judicial immunity. They can't be sued within the scope of their appointment order, within the scope of their role. But with the co-parenting counseling, it is a lower level intervention. And so, I think if the parents are willing to work together, make a good faith effort, reach agreements, willing to be reasonable. I think co parenting counseling can be very effective. Sometimes, though, people aren't really wanting to engage in co parenting counseling, it's very triggering for them to work with the other parent. Maybe they've been a victim of domestic violence. Now, mind you, if they have been a victim of domestic violence, it's often contraindicated to do the co-parenting counseling. But sometimes there's not a finding that they've been a victim of domestic violence, and they feel that they have, and they just find it incredibly triggering. But generally, if the parties are willing to work with a professional and keep their conflict away from the court system and reach agreements with that professional, it can be of great benefit to them and their children.
Kaylin, I can already see maybe a parent that's stumbled upon this. They're listening to this and they maybe feel a little overwhelmed. Maybe they're going through something similar of trying to decide between the two. How would you walk them through not only the structure of how each one works, but like you said, like some of the little things, like a parent coordinator is, appointed by a judge and they've got, like you said, qualified or quasi immunity. So, like, how do you walk them through which one works best for them?
Yeah, well, we generally want to start out with a lower level intervention, because once you get a parenting coordinator involved, people can try to remove that parenting coordinator for bias. That seems to happen more in my experience with parenting coordinators rather than co-parenting counselors. Their appointment is generally limited, for usually it's 2 years. So I would want to start out with a lower level intervention. Um, for lower to moderate conflict, the co-parenting counseling is generally recommended. The willingness to collaborate, and no need for decision making authority. When you have a parenting coordinator, these parents are usually the definition of a high conflict co-parenting unit. They can't reach agreements. They're protracted and repetitive filings. The court's exhausted. The lawyers are exhausted. And so in those types of situations, I will say to the parents, hey, you might want to consider a parenting coordinator. Sometimes they're amenable to that. Sometimes they're not.
Kaylin, thinking back on your work and years of doing this, has a situation come to mind, obviously without getting into specifics, but one that kind of illustrated how choosing the right service made a noticeable difference for the child or even the overall stability of the family?
I have definitely had cases where the parents have been really happy with the co-parenting work that I've done, or I've heard about other cases where there's a parenting coordinator and the parents are happy. I mean, I can't get into specifics about my own cases, but the parenting coordination can be really effective because if you just have a co-parenting counselor, such as myself, if I'm in that role and agreements aren't reached, then it's nothing's there to make the parties will have to file in court to get a decision on an issue. Like, let's say they can't figure out where the child should go to school, or any decision that comes up. Their recourse then, if you can't resolve it in co-parenting, is through the legal process. Whereas if there's a parenting coordinator appointed and they've stipulated to that parenting coordinator can make a decision. Like I mentioned that parent has a right. If a parent objects, they have a right to object to that decision through the court process. But the parenting coordinator, the judges tend to give a lot of deference to that parenting coordinator, because they're out in the field, working intimately with the partners, with the parties, possibly meeting the children. So the parties can object, but of course the parenting coordinator, there's a lot of deference given. So in situations where there's protracted conflict that's ongoing, I have seen parenting coordinator help reduce that conflict.
Kaylin, let me ask you because you just invoked the courts there. So, and obviously we mentioned about the parent coordinator is, court appointed. So, what tends to, or what have you seen in your history that tends to influence whether a judge leans towards the parenting coordinator versus the recommendation of the co-parenting counseling?
Yeah. So, what tends to influence a judge uh, leaning towards appointing of a parent? Well, remember, it has to be by mutual consent of the parents. But what I mean, if the parents consent to it, then the court will typically consent to it as well. So the court in California doesn't really have the authority to just appoint a parenting coordinator over the objection of a party. They have to stipulate to that agreement. The terms of the parenting coordination are really specific in that court order. And so if the parties agree to it, the judges tend to support that and will sign off on that order.
Caitlin, I want to ask you about, let's say the families, the conflict is truly intensive. We've talked about obviously high conflict custody cases in previous episodes, but the conflict is super intense, but the parents are still committed to improving communication. How then do these two paths support the children differently?
Yeah, that's a provocative question. So how do the paths? Well, like I said, the co-parenting role is a lower level intervention, and it's generally confidential. And there is a very important therapeutic component. I in that role, I cannot make decisions. The parents will either have to come to agreements or go to the court system. In a parenting coordination role, it is non-confidential, and the parenting coordinator has decision making authority. As long as they stay within the confines of their court appointed role, they need to stay within the scope of their role. So those are the two different perspectives.
Caitlin, as we put a bow on today's episode, let's say the listener that's been listening to this, they're still trying to figure out which option might align a little bit better with their situation. What are some key questions that you would recommend that they consider to get more clarity about the type of support that's going to ultimately fit the family's needs?
Yeah, so typically, I would always generally recommend to the parents that they start out with a co-parenting counselor because there's there's more opportunity for agreement. They don't feel like they're, the I don't get to make decisions in that role, and really help them reach agreements together. And it's a therapeutic role. Whereas if that doesn't work, at that point, I would. Work with the parents and say, hey, and I've done this before, you might want to consider a parenting coordination. I would talk about the pros and cons. There are guidelines for parenting coordination through the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. I would encourage them to educate themselves, and then I would encourage them, if they have counsel, to talk to their counsel about it so that they're making an informed decision and feel good about that decision. Because once that parenting coordinator is appointed, it's generally a 2-year term, and it's very hard if you don't want to work with that parenting coordinator. It's very hard to file a motion, for example, to remove that PC. So.
It's great information as always. Caitlin, I can't thank you enough for giving us a few moments here, and thank you and continued success to you.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Thank you to everyone for listening to this installment of Bridging the Gap, Law, Therapy, and Justice. If you want to learn more about Caitlin's clinical, legal, and forensic services, do me a favor right now. Visit CaitlinBurgess.com. You're going to find all the resources there that are designed to support the families, the attorneys, mental health professionals that will help navigate complex or these high conflict custody matters like we've been discussing. Thank you again for listening. But before you go, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe, leave a review, and comment, or share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. I am Mike Leon. See everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.